I'm going to kick things off today. My name's Hyatt Frobose. For those of you that don't know me, I'm with Jyga Technologies. We make GESTAL branded products, and I serve as the U.S. director. I've got a couple other people here that I'll introduce in a little bit, but as I started to allude there, the elephant in the room is that we're getting hit from all sides, whether it's us here in the swine industry or if we're talking dairy or poultry, laying hen. We're facing pressures from outside forces, whether that's regulatory or retail consumer, and I think we're burying our head in the sand if we try to pretend that that's not happening. Meanwhile, we've got a lot of existing facilities and maybe some questionable profitability in our industry right now that makes making these decisions on how to address these outside forces pretty challenging at times. So I want to keep us moving. We just got 45 minutes today, and we're gonna start with going over some data that both myself and Mark Hobart from Ag Properties, who's joining us today as my co-host, are going to present to you guys some numbers to look at and process. And then we want to make sure we save plenty of time for a panel discussion. We're pleased to have Pat Hord from Hord Family Farms based in Ohio, as well as Dr. Paul Yeske, who has already been featured this morning, but he's based here in Minnesota with the Swine Vet Center to give us some producer feedback in addition to some of the numbers that we present. So I'm going to start things off before handing off to Mark with some numbers and just kind of unpack this opportunity and set the stage for what we're discussing. But I kind of like this picture because this is not uncommon for what I see in my daily life. Is we've got a lot of facilities with tired metal or completely worn out metal that's 15 to 30 years old, and a lot of these facilities that are in need of either being mothballed or some type of a facelift or upgrade because the equipment's tired. And that's where a lot of producers, like some of our panelists, find themselves. Meanwhile, as many of you know, the costs of new construction as well as the financing of that new construction is, effectively cost prohibitive right now. And I think that's part of what makes this topic relevant to you guys in the room, hopefully, is that we're going to need to find ways to invest in the facilities we have in light of the current financial situation, and we're going to hopefully dissect a little bit what those options look like. I think we all know that varying gestation housing options exist, but it's not all that common that you get the chance to look at them side by side. And I think regardless of where you feel stalls are as far as legitimacy, in the wake of Prop 12 being upheld by the Supreme Court, in the wake of some state ballot initiatives, I think we can all at least look inwardly and say, going back into an existing stall barn with 100% new stalls is a questionable investment. And we're forced to look at what are our other options and weigh the pros and cons of those scenarios. So with that in mind, my colleague from Ag Properties and myself wanted to put together an economic model where we could really do an apples to apples comparison of an existing footprint with some different things inside of it and the cost of that as well as the space efficiency. Ultimately, our bottom line is to look at, in light of these outside pressures and this regulatory environment, can we create a sow farm that is versatile and flexible in nature, that it can withstand whatever comes next? And I think we're naive if we don't think that there is something. So as a reminder, we've only got 45 minutes here, so maybe this is a subject for a follow-up NPIC event, but what's not on the agenda today is speculating about what comes next. I think we take things as it comes. We know that Prop 12 has been held up and we're having to meet that California market. The same goes for Q3, but I think otherwise we're going to treat this as is today. And if you're watching at all what's going on in Europe, they're getting a lot of pressure on the farrowing side. And that's a subject that probably needs more than 45 minutes to cover, but we know we don't have time for that today, and presently that's not something we're seeing any immediate pressure on here. So we're going to set farrowing aside, and we're going to treat your farrowing barn in these scenarios as able to run in its own current situation. I talked a little bit about the cost prohibitive nature of new construction, but at $70+ a square foot for new construction, that usually makes people take some pause. Other questions that are pretty tough for us to answer today, maybe our panelists can weigh in on these, or you guys have some burning questions, is whether there's going to be more premiums available for some of these added welfare options, be it Prop 12 compliance or just traditional OPG or otherwise. There's also the obvious question of, can we run these farms with equivalent performance? I think that's a conversation for our panelists as well. And finally, I think it's going to depend on your system and your personnel and your procedures on whether technology options can be successfully implemented in your system. We're going to present some different ones today, but I think there's a chance to look at different ones in different ways. So with that, I'm going to hand off to my colleague Mark Hobart, who's going to talk to us about the model that we presented and the actual scenarios that we're looking at today.
All right, thanks, Hyatt. So what we've been asked over the last 18 months or more is time and time again by producers, by lenders, by vendors, processors, what are we going to do in the gestation barn, and what options do we have in there when we're talking purely a remodel scenario. And knowing that there's not enough time in the year to get out to every single one of your farms and put something together, we wanted to get a model put together with a number of different scenarios in one footprint so that we could scale it across the different barns. So we can have a generalized look at what does it look like when we talk different housing models. So this chart here has a lot going on, but it's the database behind everything that we're going to go through. So my part of this is going to be going through the different drawings to explain here's the 7 different remodel scenarios, and then we'll get back into some charts comparing back to really a base model that is our base 100% stall. So we're going with a 3,000 head gestation barn. It's 126 foot wide, 512 foot long, and our first scenario is going to be the cost to go put exactly back what is there, remove, replace 3,000 stalls. And then we're going to work down and do 2 different OPG models, and then we're going to go through 3 different Prop 12 models, and then finally we'll get to kind of the punchline of a hybrid type model to go through there. Thing to note here on our OPG models, that OPG is at 18 square foot, just to have a baseline consistency with that. And then on any of the the electronic sow feeding, the ESF, it's a back out freestall ESF model that we're working with. So as we get through that, we'll go through the 7 different scenarios and get into some tables and charts. First scenario again is the 100% stall barn. That's our base package. We're assuming that this is in a structurally sound facility. So the pit is good, the slats are good. It's a fully slatted barn. It's not a partially slatted barn. We know there's issues with that or additional challenges when you look at doing an OPG or a Prop 12 model on a partially slatted, and the structure is good. So that's our baseline. The only thing we're touching with our numbers and our costs that we're going to show you is the housing itself, leaving the ventilation alone, just saying static and trying to get to as much apples to apples comparison as we can. So that's our base model that we're going to come back and compare to. Then our next model is going to be a post-preg check OPG with a stanchion. So after preg check, we're going to move into 18 square foot stanchions across the way. Now here it's worthy to note, we've got 144 stalls that are coal stalls. Doesn't matter to this model as much as when we get into the Prop 12 compliant model where we can have and maintain some of those stalls. That's where we want to talk about that more, but it's worthwhile to point out here that we are taking that into account. You notice with the stanchions, and several of you have these, the rigidity of that puzzle piece, if you will, on where that has to fit. New construction, build the building around what that pen needs to look like. Remodel-wise, it's a structured puzzle piece that doesn't flow as well. Here's going to be our next OPG model, post-preg check again with electronic sow feeding for the penning. You can notice here we've got 1,152 stalls again, 144 coal stalls, but then we gain some space because of the flow of the ESF. We're able to put that throughout a little bit better. Less alleys, more utilization of that space. Oops. And there's your 3D model of it. So the ESF is, again, that free access ESF, the back out stall. And this model has 2 stalls per, or feed stations per pen. Those are our 2 OPG models. Now we're into the Prop 12. So we're utilizing 768 free access stalls in this model. And post-preg check, we're going to move them into stanchions. And again, now the stanchion is going to be a 24 square foot. You can see the feed line and feed access, what we have for lost space there. Obviously our stocking density goes way down in that Prop 12 model as we work across that, but there's a view of the free access and then the stanchions as well. Here's our next Prop 12. Again, going with the model of let's compare a stanchion to an ESF. Same thing, Prop 12, free access stalls with the ESF then. We gain back about 100 head, 144 head. going with the ESF in this model. And that was a post-preg check ESF model. Now we're going to go and change things around a little bit, and just because we get pushed, how do I maintain the head count? How do I maintain throughput and pull as many animals back in there as possible? So here we're going to go with a pre-preg check move out of the free access stall. So again, before we had 768 stalls, we're backing that down, you've got 280. We still maintain the 144 coal stalls here, but we backed down to the free access stalls. We're moving her pre-preg check into ESF pens in this model. You'll notice it's 24 square foot in the ESF pens with 2 feed stations per in that layout. Still a considerable head count reduction, throughput reduction in that model. So now we're getting to that next slide is going to be that 7th remodel scenario that we're looking at. And it ends up being what we came up with, or what people are looking at, is how do I not invest capital in a model that might be obsolete in a year, 2 years, 4 years? How do I invest in something that's going to leave me open, leave me an opportunity to potentially be available to a Prop 12 contract, or even have leverage for a Prop 12 contract? So what we did was we took that remodel 6 and ran it as an OPG hybrid. So this is actually a Prop 12 ready facility. By that we mean it's the same drawing you saw before, but in our pens, you stock it not at 24 square foot, but at the 18 square foot, and just run it as an OPG. The only additional capital required to do that, because you already had that footprint, was the extra feed station per pen. Still an investment, but it wasn't locking you into anything specific. And we'll talk more on the numbers and the comparison and the throughput cost of that here as we get into it. So here we're going to get in the charts as we compare all models across each other. This is a chart here that's just talking about total gestation space, as that's been kind of the driver throughout. How do we maintain that head count? You can see with the first 2 OPG models, marginal loss up or down. Prop 12, obviously with 24 square foot, we get a lot eaten up. With that OPG hybrid, or Prop 12 ready, we're really right in there. We're at 3,100 spaces available to that. Now again, this is purely on the construction side and the space piece of it. Production, we'll get into that later. How much of the barn is utilized? So this is something we've looked at from our standpoint on finishers a lot in the past. When you lay out a new finisher drawing, how do you not give up a lot of expensive square footage to alleys and for people and animals? So how do we need to measure that utilization? In that first remodel in the stall barn, 70% is usable. You're losing 30% of that stall barn to alleys and walk paths. Here's the last view, a lot less green on there, right? 89% utilization. And here's the table just showing the entire remodel mix. And it's a really interesting thing to study, and I think we need to look at adding that metric to all the new layouts that we do, whether it's new construction or remodels. So total retrofit cost, and then we'll move on to some more things that Hyatt has to lay over the top of this. Thought this was worthy to looking at. Total cost obviously means something when we get into cost per sow and cost per weaned pig. Really you get into the nuts and bolts, but it's interesting here across 7 pretty drastically different remodel scenarios. The mix from top end to the cheapest model here is only $300,000. You know, it's still a pretty tight race in that. It's just what do you do within that remodel scenario. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Hyatt, and he's going to get into some more of the comparisons and some of the production questions we have. Yeah.
Feed lines and stuff. Was that part of?
Yeah.
That part?
Yep. And we kept it static. You just have to trust me that we didn't move, didn't include it here and there. We tried to keep apples to apples, keep that basket the same. So.
Thanks, Mark. And just to keep us moving so we can keep rocking through these numbers and then get to some Q&A, I think it is just good to reiterate the relatively minimal changes in total cost across these scenarios. And I don't know if you mentioned it, Mark, but these are May 2024 numbers. So these are pretty current numbers for you guys as far as, and we can update that in our model if, you know, following this presentation, you guys had interest in talking about a scenario just for you. I think that's something that part of the reason we made the model was so that this could be used into perpetuity, and there's certainly other scenarios we could incorporate as well. The next slide is a little bit of a busier slide, so give me a second just to break it down. But this keeps those total cost numbers up there, but you can see in the orange we overlay the cost per sow space. So on the right-hand vertical axis is the cost per sow space, left-hand vertical axis is still total cost. Down at the bottom you can see total spaces laid over that. And just to draw attention to this, and this is one of the most, I guess, meaningful slides of our presentation, is all three of those Prop 12 scenarios you can see have an elevated cost per sow space relative to OPG. That's just back to your 24 square feet taken up on the footprint. What I think is interesting is that any of these OPG scenarios are cost neutral or cheaper per sow space than going back with 100% stalls. And I think for some of you in the audience that might be different than what you would expect. I think there's a bit of a stereotype that OPG or technology is going to be more expensive than what you're accustomed to. If we flip that and look at it on a cost per wean pig basis, this one might be a little bit more controversial for you guys, because in order to express the throughput capacity of this farm, we took, I think I got a slide here, the equation that we used was the total cost divided by the total number of spaces in that barn, divided by a 20-week production cycle, assuming a 21-day wean, and 12.5 pigs weaned per litter times 52 weeks per year. We applied that to all 7 scenarios. Probably the argument is whether you could wean 12.5 pigs in all of these scenarios exactly the same. But for the sakes of our model right now, let's just assume that we can do that. And here you can see, again, added cost, significantly higher, in particular when there's a lot more free access stalls. As Mark kind of alluded, those free access stalls are pretty they use a lot of space and they're pretty expensive, so minimizing them to minimize alleys is an advantage. But all three of the OPG options at 18 square feet actually have some cost savings on a cost per weaned pig basis. So I know what you're going to say is, really, OPG costs less than stalls in today's environment? And I think this is one of the takeaways, hopefully, for our presentation is that post-COVID, we've still seen raw materials that are quite elevated in price. We all are living with inflation today. Given that and the space constraints of an existing footprint, going back with new stalls in a barn, even if you think it's legitimate, is not the cheapest option. And so if you combine that with the regulatory environment, even if you don't necessarily need to go as far as Prop 12, any of these traditional OPG options can be cost neutral or better than going back with stalls. So then the question just comes down to, can I operate in that environment with the same level of production? Because the question that I think I hear, and I'm sure Mark has heard too, is won't we lose production as we go to OPG, and maybe differences between those scenarios? So although it's not perfect, we can even run an example here of, all right, well, let's just assume that we only wean 11.5 pigs per litter because of losses in fertility and pregnancy and sow death loss, whatever you want to apply to OPG. This is still assuming 12.5 pigs weaned for the stall farm, but only 11.5 pigs weaned for any of those OPG scenarios. And so when you look at it from an upfront cost, we're still pretty darn competitive, even if you have lower output out of those farms, because that upfront cost is so much more for the steel. And with the freedom to operate of an OPG or something similar, I think it makes you have to take a pretty close look at that. So, one of the last points that I wanted to take a little bit of time to break down before we get into some Q&A here is maintenance cost. As I talk through this with some people, certainly one of the questions that people that are unfamiliar with ESFs is, well, what's the maintenance going to be like on those compared to what I'm accustomed to? And I think for the builders in the room, I'm sure that's a question that you guys have gotten. So I don't think this slide answers all those questions, but I wanted to show you some numbers that we've collected from some customers of ours. These are 2 different systems that we collected over a 5-year period of time. The first being a 10,000 sow system that we collected their numbers from 2018 to 23, and the second from a 15,000 sow Missouri system from 2015 to 2020. And basically these slides are just showing the cost per gestation space per year in maintenance. Your cost that you spend on parts or replacements or technicians on site for ESF. So you can see some variation between sites or between systems, but overall we're looking at, in system 1, $1.44 per gestation space, and in system 2, $1.77 per gestation space. So some of you that are accustomed to stalls or other housing, you might have a good number on what your annual maintenance cost is for those barns, but these are at least something to get you in the ballpark on the cost to maintain an ESF barn in today's environment. Mark and I were having a conversation yesterday that I thought was interesting. Just the cost of having to go in and weld backstraps onto stalls after they've worn out is not a cheap investment, right? So it's kind of important to have a good comparison there to really to flatten the comparison.
We figured real quick math on a 20-year stall, we had to go back in and do the back strap, was $1.25 a year over the lifetime of that strap that we spent on that, so it's not nothing.
Yeah. So like we said, we knew that some of these slides are not going to answer all of your questions, but we really wanted to lay out some scenarios that we think are common. These are the most common scenarios that we're seeing across the country. Different ones in different situations might apply. But now we'd like to hear from you guys in the audience as to what do you think of those numbers? What questions do you have? Pat and Paul are gracious enough to join us. I know they both have experience with varying types of housing, and that's part of the reason that we asked them to be able to weigh in on this. But I guess I'd hand it off to the audience to keep the conversation going. We got about another 20 minutes, so look forward to first question. The first one I'd ask for Paul and Pat and Mark as well is, one of the questions that Mark kind of led to that I see from time to time is a lot of these barns of this age are partially slatted. So in your vantage point, what have you seen from barns that have had to remodel to OPG or Prop 12 that are partial slatted? What factors do these models not take into account with a partially slatted facility?
With the partial slats, one of the challenges is you can't really play with the layout. You're stuck to, you're going to have that solid portion, and when you put that into a pen, unfortunately, you've got a solid portion in the pen. And kind of no matter what you do, that always becomes a little bit of a challenge from a dunging pattern standpoint, and there's really no good way around that. Certainly can be done with taking out and making like a stanchion style barn where you cut the crates back or you put new stanchions in. That's certainly been one of the common ones that's been done, but they're not necessarily overly friendly just because you got more of that partial slat to deal with.
Yeah, we've done we have one farm that we converted from OPG from all crates to OPG here in the last couple of years, and so yeah, that's been our challenge. It's not been as bad as what we originally thought as far as dunging patterns. It seems like it's just you have to watch your stocking density and those kind of things and where your air is dropping out at. But so.
One thing that I've seen, especially with Prop 12 remodels or Prop 12 expansions, when we do some of these, with a partial slat barn, one of the surprises that I was not prepared for initially was the challenge with maintaining dunging patterns at 24 square feet in a partially slatted facility versus 18 or 19 square feet. I underestimated the challenges that would bring, but when you really boil it down, if those sows have that much room to choose where they want to lay, if there's an area that's cool or isn't conducive to be in a laying area, it's going to become a bathroom area. And so I don't know that it's markedly impacted the performance of those farms, but the optics and the worker, how much they like working in that environment is tougher, and it certainly oftentimes requires additional cleaning. So I think that's something that surprised me as we first started doing some of the Prop 12 remodels that were partially slatted. And so now if somebody comes to me and wants to lay out a barn that they want to go Prop 12 and I find out it's partially slatted, the first thing that I ask them is, are you sure? Because I think it's one of the unintended consequences of having a limited amount of slatted space and slatted area.
Pat, you converted one of your farms over. Have you noticed any difference in performance between your created farm and when you moved to, I didn't say it was Prop 12?
No, the one I was referring to was OPG. So no, initially it's a struggle for the first turn through the barn when you have the same sows. If you're not repopulating, it's a struggle. Those sows getting adjusted to being in a pen. But then once you get past that, it seemed to settle back in and be, the production was, I would say, would be equal. So the mortality's a tick higher. Our experience has been is that our mortality is a couple % higher on OPG, so that would be stalls for 40 days and then pens versus all stalls.
Yeah, with the stanchion type systems too, I was going to say that's been one of the challenges is you are feeding for a pen. And so you end up with a little higher feed use just because you're feeding by a pen basis, not an individual basis. If you go with ESF, then you've got that opportunity to feed by an individual basis back again. So that corrects for some of those. You know, I think there's some opportunities if you say what are, you know, we always look at comparing back to what we used to do versus the opportunity side. If you look at some of the technology where we have the opportunity to have 2 different feed systems coming in, that sort of things, we can feed different diets to different animals with the ESF, and so there's some opportunities that we didn't necessarily have before that now become more available versus some of the traditional stalls or the traditional stanchion type systems.
Paul, you've been, you know, you get the chance to see or converse with a lot of consulting relationships. I mean, what are you seeing any of the sow performance numbers coming out of those Prop 12 facilities in the wake of these remodels, and what are they looking at performance-wise?
Yeah, I'd agree with Pat's comments. As you convert an existing population, there's certainly some fallout on that first go-round. Those first 20 weeks are definitely interesting, but once you get through the system and the people learn, there is a learning curve for the staff as well. And so as the people learn to manage the system, I think we can manage the systems effectively. I think we can see very similar production. I would agree with Pat too that mortality seems to be a little bit higher when we look at the pen situations, and it does take probably a little bit more from a management side to operate those systems and get the same performance. So I think that's a little bit of the difference there, but you can certainly get the same performance out of the building.
People talk about struggles on the first turn of an existing population. Could you be a little more specific as to like what that is?
Yeah, the biggest struggle is when you got animals that have been used to stalls and you put them into a pen situation. They may or may not have the right structure, and so they could get by really well in a crate where they can't get by so well in the pen. And so you end up with some more lameness and some more mortalities and some more culls because of their body structure. And as you have animals that age through the system, it's less of an issue from aging through versus being transferred over in the middle of the process.
Yeah, it's really about farrowing rate. I mean, you breed, but your pregnancy loss is more, and that's due to multiple reasons. But one of them is lameness of pulling them out, and we've had to convert all of our system to pens that wasn't already done over the last 5 years or so, and so it's a common theme. So
yeah, I think the biggest thing for people to learn is that timely pulling sows from pens that aren't competing. That's probably the one thing that as we go back and look at them, it's making sure those animals get identified early, get taken out early, and getting the opportunity to recover and rehabilitate.
So then do you have like hospital crates that you can use, or is that?
Yeah, so in the OPG situations, a lot of people will have some additional stall capacity to put some of those animals into that are non-competing or have issues in the pen. And that's one of the challenges, is that it takes some of that flex space that you either got empty space in the crate or you got empty space in the pen. You can't have both. You can't have everything full, because then you got nowhere to go with them, and then you make poor decisions. In the Prop 12, you can do those sows as exemptions, and you can exempt those sows and allow them to be if you work with your herd veterinarian, you can do an exemption for those animals to allow for rehabilitation on those.
At 24 square foot per sow, the space utilization becomes the killer, right? And I think these slides illustrate that effectively. So what I've seen more and more farms attempting to be Prop 12 compliant and doing really well is incorporating either hospital crates or hospital pens within the stanchion or ESF pen, so that we have a place to take that girl that needs hospitalized in a timely fashion without necessarily taking her out of the space she was initially allocated. And so that depends a little bit on your housing strategy, but what you got to minimize at the 24 square feet is girls taking up 2 spots in the barn. And so it's certainly a conversation as part of this is crate utilization or space utilization, because it's a different ball of wax than it is with individual stalls. But I think we skimmed over the hospitalization techniques for the sakes of the model, but if you noticed on some of those layouts, there were stalls in the corner of those pens, and those were hospital crates. But I also have a lot of farms that use hospital pens strategically. The key is whether they're truly exemptions or whether they have the ability to turn around freely, which is part of the requirements for Prop 12. So it's an important detail, and I would say especially in an OPG scenario, one thing to make sure is if you have a whole barn that's OPG, don't overlook having some hospital spaces in that barn, because if you make it harder on your people to get them back to a hospital crate, then it's not going to happen. And that's some of the things that I think is a difference between the highs and the lows on sow mortality and lameness is, do you make it easy on your people to intervene and react to them quickly? And if you make it so that one person can do it on a Friday afternoon or a Sunday morning, it's more likely to get done. Bob, you had a question? Yeah, so I'll just repeat the question quick. Bob's question was, when we do a pre-implantation move into pens, for Prop 12, for example, does that impact performance differently than, say, an OPG or even maybe free access stalls through preg check and then move to ESF or stanchions? Paul, or do you got a comment on that?
And I think what they've got drawn up here is where you breed them in the stall and then you move them to the pen right away. So they're moving there very rapidly. But there's still certainly going to be a little more loss. That's going to depend. It wasn't as big as anticipated, but there's still some more loss as you move those animals to the pens versus if they would have stayed in the crates. So, and your fallout, if you go with the preg check model, the fallout from the preg check model is also higher than it would have been in stalls as well. There's more animals that will fall out of the group after you preg check them till you get them to the farrowing house. And it varies a lot with the farms, and as they get better at managing the system, those numbers do tend to come closer in line with what we would see in the stall barns.
The only other thing I might add to that is I think it really comes down to taking the design approach really seriously, and whenever possible, if you can maintain pen integrity so you can minimize your regrouping events, that I think is a big differentiation point between those that are successful and those that aren't. If you have multiple mixing events, that's just another opportunity for stress and aggression and lameness. And if you can set it up right on the design phase to minimize that, you probably can never eliminate it because we're fighting biology here. But if we can try to maintain the pen integrity, so for example, in the bottom pens around the free access stalls, those pens are sized a little bit bigger in terms of number of animals than the pens on the north end of this layout to basically account for some natural fallout from rebreeding. So I think the bottom pens are 30, or let's see, sorry, this one doesn't have it perfect, but here, these are 35 head pens on the bottom. This is that Prop 12 compliant option, and on the top they're 32. So that's assuming you're losing about 3 of the girls bred due to recycling or not confirmed pregnant. Good question.
And I think if I was considering building another project or doing another project today, more pens are going to be more friendly than less. If you can get those animals sized up, if you get your gilts together and you get your P1s together and then your older sows, when you've got everyone together in one happy group or family, they don't all play well nice together. And so the more you can split that up, I think the easier time we see of being able to get those numbers closer on farrowing rate.
So in a Prop 12 pen situation,
Rob, you got numbers on that? So I think you would have a good opinion on this because I know you guys are using your hospital crates pretty efficiently, but what's the total space utilization of your operational space? Like how much empty space do you got? How much slop do you have in the system? Is that a fair assessment?
The hospital crates are huge, because, you know, with the VFD, with the directive on. You would probably, at the end of the day, you're losing space per pen on the 68 pen, on the top 12, by the utilization of, and I would have, the ones that have 6 hospital crates per 60 head is the best. And the whole key to that is the veterinary side of it. It is truly allowing you to treat the animal. It seems like most of them go in and they probably won't come back out. But also, what we've noticed is you get better at selecting your animals that you breed. And that's the biggest key to the whole project, is just not breeding that shit animal that you bred when you had a crate. Because she's gonna go back. So you get a lot better at breeding good animals, period. But I'd say we're down to space per pen lot right now with good hospital pen utilization.
It's one of the conversations though, because sometimes when somebody comes to us and asks, us to do a layout for ESF pens, the initial thought is well, we'll make all the ESF pens the same size, and we'll just place them in there after breeding and just pull out opens as need be. The challenge with that is we can't overstock initially, as you mentioned with California Prop 12. So we might stock them at 24 square feet at breeding, but by the time we come to farrowing, those pens are understocked further at 27 square feet or something. So that's part of the reason why we didn't even include that in the model for today. But there are a few farms where we've converted some finishers or something where we were long on space. And in those situations, it might make sense to do for lack of a better term, I call it set it and forget it ESF model, where we basically don't go back and tighten up like we do in these models. And so it's really going to be case by case on that front.
And it depends upon your configuration. If you're able to have that treatment pen as part of the pen, that gets that square footage back to work. And so there is a huge difference there in how you lay that out and how you execute it. And if you don't have that move or remix event, you give up that space, like you said. If you've got to just place them right after they're bred, and there's going to be fallout, there is in crates. That's why we develop parking lots. And so, but if you can use that, if you don't lose that pen space, if you build it within the pen, that has helped to reduce some of that, or to make better utilization, better pen utilization.
Adam.
Paul, maybe for you, since you've seen more. Have you noticed any difference in genetics from one genetic company to the next? Handles the transition better than the other? And then the second part of that question is does our genetics need to change with handling space? I'm assuming some of the mortality issues are from fighting and that kind of stuff. Does the genetic pendulum swing to a more docile animal to accommodate that, and you can get that back in time?
Yeah, it's hard to say because you never have the two side by side, to see and under the same, or generally you don't have those side by side, and you don't have them the same parity side by side if they are side by side. So it's always hard to make that. But I think there are some genetic differences. I do think the biggest thing is working on, like Rob said, it's selection and making sure that you've got animals that are not cheating the selection. And I don't mean to point fingers at anybody, but particularly when we have on-site GDUs, it's usually, if they've got 3 legs and 2 holes, they're going to be bred. And for this system, for the OPG type systems, they got to be good structurally sound animals to go in there. So you do have to have a little bit more selection on the selection side to make sure you've got the right animals. And that can be a little bit more challenging to just get everybody up to speed on, but I think it is an important piece And we see all the different genetic lines out there in the pens. I think it goes back to, you put two sows together, they're going to fight. And they've got to establish dominance, and some fight longer than others. But they're still going to fight, and they still are going to work to establish who's dominant in the pen. That's where, if you can keep them more based by age and size, so if you can keep the gilts together, that seems to go pretty well. It's always interesting to watch a startup farm, because as gilts, everybody says, man, this Prop 12 isn't too bad. You know, everything goes pretty good. They're all gilts in the pen. They all get along. Life seems pretty good. You go to Parity 2, well, they don't get along quite so good. And you get to Parity 4, and it's like, holy cow, this is different. And so, again, I think if you can separate those more, that's probably been one of the things. If I could go back and redesign some, I'd have a little bit smaller pen grouping sizes so I could split more.
Yes?
I got a few questions. Has your replacement rate changed, and if so, what degree? Second question, I know Prop 12 has specific standards, but for OPG, how long do they need to be in a stall, or how long can they be in a stall versus 10? Is there any standard for that, or should I specify that?
I'll just repeat it quick back here, but the first part of the question was, say the first part again. Does your replacement rate change on the gilt side with OPG versus STALLS?
Right.
And the second part was,
What standard is there for how long they have to be?
for OPG, is there any standards on how long they can stay in a stall, right?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first. There today isn't quote unquote a definition of how long is OPG. And I don't think we want that as an industry. I think we want to be careful to not ask for that. Careful what you ask for, because you may have to live with it. And so today, that's... Yeah, and I'm not necessarily talking about legally. I'm just saying on the OPG, there's not a standard that you got to have weeks or time. There's some rough guidelines that people use, but there's some flexibility there. I think we want to keep that flexibility as an industry. So when you're looking at remodels and that sort of stuff, whether I might be 4 weeks in the stalls or 6 weeks or 8 weeks in the stalls, it depends upon how that remodel goes. And I'd like to have that flexibility to continue to be able to do that and still be able to qualify. On the replacement rates, because there is a little bit higher mortality, they generally do go up a little bit higher when you go to an OPG or Prop 12 type scenario.
Like how much?
It depends upon the farm so much, but I'd say you're easily going to go up a couple percent.
Yeah, I'd say that I'd agree with that. And I think just realistically also, and you should have had this off earlier on, but like was mentioned earlier, you really got to work hard in the gilt development area and make sure that we've got good structure. We've spent a lot of time going back and retraining and having somebody make sure. There's times you can get a little sloppy on those gilts coming in, like Paul said, and so we've had to really get picky on the structure and making sure we're not bringing all the animals in. We're getting the ones that are set up, and that will help you on your replacement rate. But
Dew claws become one of the big issues. There tends to be a few more of the dew claw injuries.
And I think it's worth mentioning, just to wrap that up, and we're running up against our time window, but on a Prop 12 compliance situation, gilts do not need to be housed at 24 square feet until they are eligible to breed. And so in many cases, producers are leaving them in a GDU pen, or maybe even crate breaking them in a crate, as long as no artificial insemination is going on in that crate. As long as they're moved to a Prop 12 compliant housing environment at the time of breeding, they're eligible. And so that's some of the nuances or details that different farms are playing with that a little bit on how to optimize space. in these Prop 12 remodels or expansions.
On Ohio's law, it says flexibility is exactly what we try to strive for, the livestock carriage board. We are the only state that has a livestock carriage board that's the standard, but it says in the statute, confirm pregnancy, but it doesn't say that the vet has to, at what 6 weeks. We don't want to lose that. It's the reason why we established the livestock carriage board, so the vets are determining that as it comes through and you get access to streams.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well, as you heard from the other room, we're out of time, but appreciate the good questions and appreciate everyone's participation in this. Hope we took away some interesting information. Yes, Daryl.
I'm curious if you remember the number of times as far as the throughput assumption, that's what you use for the model. I'm curious if you've been able to have any context on achievability or Dr. Yeski, anything you've seen in systems as far as, is that a fair assumption to build a model on, or what are you guys seeing?
You're saying like the graphs and the different.
The model based on assuming you can get the same production for stalls versus open pen versus ESF versus stanchion versus whatever. I'm just curious if to ground that assumption.
Is it achievable to maintain performance in these scenarios?
Yeah. So we're early on. We're just farrowing our first Prop 12 farm. So we're pretty. I can't answer that, and I think Paul or Hyatt may have a different one on open pen. We feel like we've been able to stay very similar on production wise. And maybe could argue maybe even a little better at times. That we've not. The challenge is we have a little bit more mortality in pens. So I mean that's been our experience. Of a couple percent was historically what we saw. So, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say, Daryl, that what we've seen is, and again, there's always some conversion when you go from one to the other. And so with good managers, we've been able to see those farms perform very similarly when we compare them on production parameters. I would agree with Pat that you've got some mortality issues that are going to be higher in the OPG or the Prop 12 type scenarios. That's just nature of the beast there. But as far as the overall performance and the wean pigs, those numbers can be very comparable across system and probably a little bit more manager dependent as the managers get accustomed to working those new systems, because it won't be the same if they come from a stalled environment and transition. There's some animal husbandry things, identifying those sows early, getting them pulled out to hospital pens. All those things have an impact. But once you get operating steady state with both, they can perform very, very similarly. But you do have more mortality. Our experience has been more mortality, more feed cost in the pen situation because you're feeding a pen versus feeding an individual. Now, if you've got the ESF system, you can back up and feed individuals. And the ESF, particularly with the option to have a couple different feed lines, gives us some options that we haven't had in the past before too. And so you can do some different things there that we wouldn't have been able to do in a traditional barn. So there's probably some savings that way if you look at a day-to-day operating cost. But again, depends upon the system you put in and the ability to do some of those things.
Last thing I'll just add on that is when somebody asks me that question, because it's a common question, right? How's this going to change my performance? I think the answer that sums it up the most effectively is that of the 150,000 sows that I work with that are Prop 12 or trying to be Prop 12 compliant, I think the top end is just as good and maybe even at times, even better than maybe what they were in stalls, but I'd say comparable to stalls. But the variation between those Prop 12 farms is bigger than maybe what I was accustomed to seeing with OPG or stalls. And so that hits on Paul's point. If it's more management and labor dependent, the people that have the really good SOPs, I think, can achieve that. But when you got high turnover or labor quality issues, that can cost you. There's the path to success is narrower than it maybe was with stalls. Yes.
So in the designs that you showed us, roughly how many pigs, or how many sows per pen, assuming static pens, so could you share with us some of the lessons learned, best practices, because I know we've seen really big pens, really small pens, hopefully with all the experiences we've got so far, we kind of come to a standardized or best practice for number of sows per pen and static versus dynamic, I assume static.
I'll let Paul comment on that, but it's an excellent question. And I thought Paul talked about this well in the first session, so.
Yeah, I think what we've seen over time is that, particularly as we went to the Prop 12, was the closer we can get those animals matched by parity, for example. So putting the gilts together, putting the P1s together, even the P2s if you can to a certain extent, but the older sows together has been helpful in seeing those perform better. So if I had my option today, if I was building today, I would build smaller pens so I could do more of that splitting of those groups. It also gives you more flexibility if you're going with like a stanchion to being able to adjust for body condition and be able to, when you're quote unquote feeding the pen. And so I think when we designed them initially, of course you're always trying to control costs, and you're always thinking, well, we can do this with the maximum number. If I had to do over again, I'd have a little smaller pen so I had a little more flexibility, or figure out a way to do it flexible so I could move those pens and resize some of the particularly free access.
2 points that I would add on that quick. Just one being smaller pens and static pens are a little easier for the workers in the barn to execute. All the animals are at the same stage of pregnancy at the same time. We're kind of doing all in, all out flow. It seems easier to execute that. There are advantages to a larger pen from a dynamic, from a space utilization standpoint, if you can keep them full, but then it comes down to some of the nuances of execution. But I think one thing that Dr. Yeske maybe left out is when we're moving sows to pens right after breeding, or at breeding, technically in Prop 12, one of the differences between those who are being really successful and those who aren't is how quickly they're getting those girls into their resting place after breeding. And I think that's been a point of differentiation from some, is if I can get those girls into their pen after breeding within 2 or 3 days, I'm less likely to see pregnancy loss or embryo loss due to that aggression that's occurring, because maternal recognition of pregnancy hasn't occurred yet. And so if we make those pens smaller, even if we wean multiple times a week, we can fill those pens we can do it all at once instead of trickle filling those pens and prolonging that aggression. And I think that's a key differentiation point that has led me also to drift towards smaller pens in Prop 12 scenarios than maybe what I had historically done with OPG.
Smaller pen being 25 head per pen?
It depends
on the
upon
farm.
your farm. Yeah, so that's why I can't give you a number. You've got to size it to what's reasonable for your farm. And as we started some of the first startups and went into Prop 12 on the first startup, man, everybody thought this is going to be not so bad. We got all gilts, they all get along pretty good. It's amazing how this works. And then they turned into P2s, and all of a sudden, they're not quite as friendly as they were before. And boy, by the time they got to be P4s, we need to separate these so that they can compete more evenly. And so that's kind of back to that point, is I think you've got by having more flexibility there, you have the ability to give them to compete more against what their peers are. And again, it's going to depend upon the size of farm and what that number is going to be and how it lays out. And there's a whole bunch of factors that go into it.
Question, Daryl, one thing that we didn't get time to talk about last time, but I think it would behoove us to talk about ventilation and heating in these barns, because I think that's something that the first winter that we had some Prop 12 facilities that we remodeled, that's something that we didn't take into account. But what's your experience been on those where you've changed the inventory significantly from what it was as a stall barn, and how producers are managing around that?
Yeah, I think the opportunity there with the ventilation, as you change the ventilation, particularly if you're going to Prop 12, Some of the remodels, we also did some filtration projects, so it was actually a benefit because you could make all the filtration work a little easier because you got that extra capacity on the ventilation side. But again, when we did the startups on the Prop 12s, you got a lot of square footage and you had all P1s. Well, it takes a little more heat because you don't have those older sows generating that heat in the room. But if you're static population, as we got those herds and they aged more, that become less of an issue for us as far as heating. But you are going to have a little more. If it gets into really cold weather, you're going to have a little more heating capacity there, and if you got the extra ventilation in the summertime, it's probably not a bad thing. And with Prop 12, the sows can certainly get spread out very, very nice. That's one opportunity there, is that they can spread out nicely when it gets hot. So,
Just to follow up on that, we talked about this in the last group, but partially slatted versus fully slatted. I don't know if we talked about that completely in the model here today, but for the sakes of this example, we talked fully slatted facilities because it makes the conversation a little easier. But not all of our facilities that are 15 to 30 years old are fully slatted barns, as you guys well know. So I think each of us has learned some things with partially slatted facilities, but I guess I'd ask the panelists what their experience has been in trying to do Prop 12 or even OPG with partial slat facilities as compared to fully slatted.
yeah, my comment to partial slats is they're partially dirty usually, but that's one of the challenges. And so one of the challenges is the ability to have you don't have as much flexibility in pen layout, and so that can change some of what you're able to do versus if you have all total slats. And so as you come into those situations, you're going to have a little different constraints, and so they're not as bad as the old partial slatted days, but as you get to Prop 12 and they got more square footage, that tends to be a little bit, there's more area for dunging and that sort of thing. And the sows can lay probably in the same amount of space they're going to lay in. They just have more space around. So again, there's just more challenges with that layout and making it all work within that partial slatted situation.
Yeah, we don't have any Prop 12 partial slat, but we do have some OPG, and we were really concerned about it going in. Now we're stocked at 19 square foot in the pen, so but it's not been as bad as what we thought. So I guess don't be, if it's your only option in this way, don't be too scared of it. But they are a little dirtier, but it's not been near as bad as what we originally thought when we went into it. So
That's a good segue, Pat. You mentioned some of your farms being stocked around 19 square feet, and we had to choose something for our model for OPG. And in most of my scenarios, the goal is to reduce the loss of space as much as possible when you go OPG. And so 18 square feet's kind of been a typical minimum for a lot of my customers, but could you guys talk about 18 versus 19 versus 20 versus Prop 12 at 24? What's the sweet spot in your system, and does that vary depending on other things?
we've not studied like an 18 versus 19 versus 20. I mean, we've had a standard square footage that we've shot. We've went for, and it's been that 19 and a half for whatever reason. I know it's what we picked early on, and it worked, so we stayed with it. Yeah, probably the challenge for us, and I think you hit on it early on, is when we either are being asked to consider Prop 12 or we have steel that's getting tired, you're really in a conundrum. As you know, we've been working through this recently, and so on a farm, and so you're really trying to figure out, like, how do you set this up for the maximum flexibility based off of the constraints that we have. And part of me is like, it's like, well, it's frustrating because we've been big believers in being post implantation. We like what we call the Ohio standard. A lot of times around people, it's 40 days or until confirmed pregnant, and then move into a pen. And We feel like, you know, when I say we've got very similar production, that's our model. It's kind of our standard now, and we've been doing it for a long time. Well, then now we're having to go like, okay, well now we have to do pre-implantation, even if we're going to stay with the 19 square feet. So and we're making things. I just feel like every time we turn around, we're making it more complicated at what we do. You know, it's like we're adding one more layer. You know, and so, you know, it is what it is, but it's, to me, that's a challenge that we're trying to thread those needles of how to give us the maximum flexibility as we look at these systems. And really that brings us back to, you know, our standard has been stanchions and crates, and so now we're back to looking at ESF and using ESF in strategic ways to give us the maximum flexibility, so that if we have to go between those square footages, we can move pretty easily.
So, you know, I thought we had a good discussion on this before on hospitalization techniques and the use, you know, space utilization in these scenarios, because that's one of the questions, right? Is, you know, a crate, we can only put one animal in there, but these pens are fluid in some ways, depending on whether we're trying to be Prop 12 compliant or not. But comments, discussion about how to use hospitals or stalls strategically in OPG and Prop 12 scenarios so that you can get animals hospitalized properly, but also utilize your space efficiently.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a lot of the space utilization, and particularly if we're in the OPG model, we know that the mortality goes up, and particularly if we're not identifying those animals early, not getting those animals pulled from the pen or treated properly, that those animals, we're going to have more issues and more problems. And so if I'm moving that animal back to a crate, then I have to have that crate space available, and I lose that space in the pen. You get the opportunity to build a treatment facility within the pen. Certainly helps to utilize that space and helps to get that animal moved at a more rapid pace, probably more pace that needs to be. And for Prop 12, then you can continue, if you get it the right configuration, you can continue to keep that animal fully compliant at Prop 12, or you can go with a veterinary directive to go ahead and pull those animals out. Again, the key is to get to early identification. The number's still going to be a little bit higher, just the nature of the beast, but you can get those numbers much closer.
And we see farms, you know, depending on their situation, using hospital stalls, hospital free access stalls, hospital pens, or at times, especially with OPG, just pulling them out to existing stalls. And I think where those are at relative to the pen space needs to be part of that discussion. I know one thing that I think we've implemented really well in a lot of farms is making sure that there's always hospital space close to the pens. You know, when I first came into the industry, I saw a lot of barns where we had a barn that was all pens and a barn that was all stalls, and the explanation was, well, we'll just walk them back to the stalls when they need hospitalized. And as I think those of you that are chuckling in the room know, that a lot of times if you make it hard on the workers to do something, it's not going to happen. And so facilitating that, whether you're Prop 12 or not, is something that I think has helped maybe be the differentiation point between those farms that can do really well on performance in pen gestation versus those that don't. Daryl, I think you had another question.
Yeah, I'm curious from, we talked earlier this morning about trying to do a better job of managing PD, birds, that type of thing. You know, when you think about stall environments, you have a very controlled atmosphere to be able to manage individual health. Can you maybe just talk a little bit, maybe without getting into too much detail, or what are some of the tips, tricks, management ways that you can go about kind of managing a significant health issue or open housing?
Yeah, the challenge is once you're in either an OPG or a Prop 12 model and you're into an open pen environment, then you've got that challenge of identifying, not only do you have to identify the sick animal, but as you get into an abortion situation, you know, particularly early on, who was the sow that aborted? You know, certainly as you go later into gestation, you can figure that out. But that is a challenge. And I would say as we switched to more of the OPG, more really when we went to Prop 12 and we started moving the sows out earlier and weren't at that roughly 40-day range, we saw more NIP show up. And us old timers that have been out in the Cargills and used to looking at the belly of the sow and making some of those decisions to re-preg check that animal, we had to teach some new skills back to the younger set of workers that hadn't had to deal with those environments. And so just being able to identify those animals a little earlier, because just because I preg check her doesn't mean she's going to farrow. And we know there's a slippage from preg check time to farrowing time and getting those animals identified. And if you can get out that 40+ day range, there's certainly less of those and they're easier to find. As you get with that earlier penning, then you get a few more of those to identify. So it is a challenge. And in the PERS breaks, again, sometimes if we've got some of the free access, while you're trying to sort out who's sick and who's not, expanding some of your veterinary directives and exemptions is one opportunity while you're going through the outbreak. But we haven't necessarily had those challenged by the auditors yet either. But that's one of the things we have done.
Any other questions? Yes, Brian.
Wayne, into a pen for Prop 12 for reimplantation from a veterinary standpoint, you get asked a lot of questions on antibody condition. Talked about pen size from Jay earlier, but just about that different mindset now.
Yeah, most of ours we would have at least a breeding stall, so they would be in like a free access till breeding, but then moved out right away to the pens. Again, that's where I say more flexibility, and it's going to depend upon the herd and the numbers and that sort of thing. If you can get those animals penned together that are more like parity, weight, all those things help make it easier for dealing with the conditioning later. The bigger pens you have, the less flexibility you have. You have to feed to the bottom end of the pen unless you've got the ESF. And the ESF, on the other hand, does give you that flexibility to go back to feeding the individual, which that's the upside to the ESF. The stanchion barns are certainly more straightforward, but you don't have that flexibility. And generally we see those having a higher feed use than a ESF or a stalled barn. It would usually be like 100 pounds to maybe 200 pounds a sow per year.
I'd say that's in the right ballpark from what I've seen too. It'll range depending on how good you are at managing stanchions and how good you are with ESF, because there's better and worse operators of that. But I think somewhere in that half a pound per sow per day is a pretty normal average. But I've seen it as low as a quarter of a pound, and I've had some people tell me it's a pound a sow, and that comes down to how are you feeding them before and after. But just to follow up on that previous question, I think something worth mentioning is there are some systems that are not necessarily using free access stalls at weaning for Prop 12. And I can think of one in particular that is having some success with it. And they're looking at it a little bit differently on the Prop 12 forming a pen side of things. Is if we get that mixing aggression out of the way before she's even bred, that getting that hierarchy established where we don't have any pregnancy to lose has some advantages. And so in some cases, there's systems that are looking at weaned sow pens where they maybe have extra space and they can get that mixing aggression out of the way before they're bred, and they're seeing some competitive performance. I wouldn't say that's the largest number, but I think that's one of the still questions or research areas that I think we as an industry need to look at, because if we give them a free access stall right away to hide in, there's some argument that you might prolong that pen hierarchy formation because they don't have to fight with each other at first, but when they finally do come out of the stall 4, 5, 6 days later, she might be a few days bred and she does have a pregnancy that's at risk. And so I think as far as the next research that needs to be done in those environments is looking at some of that mixing at weaning relative to forming those mixing events at a later time in pregnancy.
Yeah, and I think there it becomes very important that you get them sized up appropriately. In some of the systems that I've seen where they mix into pens right away is that becomes very critical there because some of those thinner sows that need more recovery don't get that opportunity to recover as quickly. And so if you can't separate those out for that recovery phase, then you're not only in the immediate time post weaning, but also post breeding, those animals need that opportunity to get back in condition. And that's where having a little more flexibility is helpful.
And part of the reason I mentioned that too is if you follow Germany, they've recently passed legislation that will require additional space after weaning. I believe it's above 50 square foot per sow, I believe. And by 2030, they've got to basically provide even more space for that wean aggression event. And that's appearing cost prohibitive to a lot of German sow producers. And so I think there's a lot of people in their European Union that see Germany continuing to decrease its sow herd population and maybe just becoming more of a finishing country because it's getting so tough to operate in that environment. Go ahead.
So in those scenarios where you're mixing like that, I can see how they could establish hierarchy, but don't they start jumping each other for heats?
Yeah, that's where feet and legs also become a much bigger issue because of the fact that you do get not only have you got the competition aspects, but you've also got as they come into heat.
And that's where you go back to your partial slat and how much concrete you have, maybe the gap in your slats, the orientation of your slats. All of those things come into focus because we're going to see more torn dew claws and more lameness events. And so I'd probably be more open-minded to doing that in a fully slatted facility than a partially slatted facility. But I've seen both, and I think they can work, but there's just a narrower path to success maybe.
Well, because we have pre-implantation mixing, and that's, if you're too close to that breed event, they're jumping.
Yeah.
From aggression, they're jumping because they're still coming out of estrus.
Trying to find that line where we mix them soon enough that we can get that pen formed, but they still need to be out of heat. Yeah, I've seen that as well. Well,
How many days after the first service, last service are you mixing, or what's the sweet spot there? 3 days?
I mean, we're trying to get at least 2, I would say 3 would be ideal.
but this goes back to the pen size a little bit too, and depends on the farm, right? If you're at 1,200 farrow and weekly versus a 6,000 farrow and weekly, you've got more animals to work with on the 6,000. But I think trying to thread that needle of trying to have them out of heat, but not to the point where they're at risk of maternal recognition of pregnancy, that aggression causing losses of pregnancy. So most of the data would say between day 3 to 7 is kind of your target window, but I know there's some PIC data that I've seen that would say that day 3 is better than day 7. So I think it's a bit of a linear decrease. So that goes back to one of the reasons why those smaller pens are oftentimes advantageous if you're trying to do pre-implantation mixing or Prop 12 compliance.
Yeah, that's been our experience is if you can get them out of heat, the quicker they can be put in a pen together, the better off you're going to be.
And I know of farms that will move them into pens the day of their last service. But it's a borderline, right? You're trying to finish stocking that pen, right? But I think that's all the time we've got for today. Appreciate the good questions and the discussion.